The work we are talking about is Beowulf, an heroic epic poem written somewhere between 650 and 750 A.D. by an anonymous poet, and the most famous specimen of Old English literature. But before we begin the story, you'll need to meet the major characters, most important of whom is, of course, the hero, Beowulf himself. Beowulf is not an Anglo Saxon. He's a member of the Geats, a Scandinavian people related to Anglo Saxons. Beowulf's life is almost divided in two parts in the poem, and so in a sense he is two characters, the younger Beowulf and the older. The youthful Beowulf is a hero who hasn't established a reputation for himself yet. He's very anxious to accomplish good and great deeds, and to behave according to his sense of form, or the ideal standards of a true noble. He's ambitious and glory-seeking, but he's also generous and kind, and never mistreats the weak. The older Beowulf is a man who's become a little weary of the struggles he's outlived. He's more contemplative and subject to melancholy, but still capable of rising to a heroic challenge. He's a good king to his people, and an admirable leader who instills confidence and loyalty. Other key characters include Hrothgar, king of the Danes. Beowulf journeys to Hrothgar's court at the beginning of the poem to rescue his people from a horrible man-eating monster. Unferth, a Danish warrior. Unferth is a member of Hrothgar's court and one of the more complex characters in the story. He taunts and incites Beowulf, and originally takes on an adversarial role to the hero. But later he supports Beowulf and even offers his own precious sword for Beowulf's use in slaying the mother of the monster. And finally there is Wiglaf, Beowulf's nephew and loyal court noble. Wiglaf plays a key role towards the end of the story, when Beowulf fights his last battle, this time against a dragon. In some ways he reminds the reader of the younger Beowulf, anxious for adventure and glory, and even a little reckless. But he's brave and stands by Beowulf when all others desert him. As the story begins, it is long ago in the Danish kingdom of Hrothgar, and a gruesome giant monster named Grendel is roaming the countryside at night. Grendel is descended from the first murderer, Cain, and has been angered by the singing of the bards. He rises from his home deep in the marsh, stalks to the king's high hall, and there devours 15 of the king's warriors at a time. Then, before departing, the monster would seize 15 more men with his huge arms and carry them back to his watery den. For 12 years this slaughter continued. The king had lost all his best men, and the strength of the kingdom was gone. The Danes evoked their ancient gods, to no avail. The poet tells us they were unaware of the Christian God. They did not know the Creator, the judge of actions. They did not know the Lord God. Then word of the terror spread across the sea to the land of the Geats, ruled by Hygelac. Hygelac had a warrior who was his principal adviser, a man of great strength and courage who was named Beowulf. When Beowulf heard the tales of Grendel's murderous attacks, he set sail at once to free the Danes from this horrible demon. His journey is described this way. Impelled over the waves by wind, the foamy prow like a bird sped onward, till the next day's hour showed ocean shores shining, lofty hills, expansive shorelands. When Beowulf and his men arrived in Denmark, they were met by a coast watcher who kept a lookout for unwelcome invaders. When he saw the weary company of 15 seafarers approaching, he was suspicious. But he could tell by their clothes and bearing that they were noblemen, and he thought of Beowulf that he'd never seen a greater earl on earth. When Beowulf told him of his intended mission, the coast watcher permitted the company to pass. The poem continues. They started out then. The spacious ship remained behind, riding on its rope. Figures of boars, bright and fire-hardened, gleamed gold-adorned above the cheek guards. In war, the boar helped guard those fierce men's lives. The men marched to King Hrothgar's high hall. There the king held a banquet feast in Beowulf's honor. The mead cup was passed around, and the boasting began. The Danish warrior Unferth, drunken with wine and jealous of Beowulf's glory, began to taunt and challenge Beowulf. He told the story of a 5-day swimming contest in which Beowulf, the Geat, was said to have been bested and lost. Beowulf denied the truth of this. He said instead that he had not only emerged victorious in the race, but had been forced to kill 9 deadly sea monsters in the course of it. One monster had carried him all the way to the bottom of the sea. Beowulf had swum for 5 days and nights in the icy water before reaching the shore. When all the boasting was done, Beowulf asked Hrothgar for the right of slaying the monster, and Hrothgar granted him that right, promising him many riches and rewards should he succeed. Beowulf said he would not use weapons against the monster, but would battle him with only his own physical prowess. When the feast was over, Hrothgar and his warriors went to bed, leaving Beowulf and his men alone in the hall. The men were fearful and had trouble sleeping, suspecting this was their last night on earth. But Beowulf slept soundly. Then, says the poem, from afar in the murky night the shadow walker approached. Grendel crashed into the room with an unlovely light, like a hellish flame in his eyes. The heavy iron door burst open at just a touch of his fingers, and he rejoiced when he saw the rich feast of human flesh that waited there before him. He grabbed one sleeping warrior, tore him up furiously, bit through his muscles and sinews, and then drank the blood in streams. Then he quickly swallowed the whole corpse, as a wolf might eat a rabbit. Then Grendel moved towards his next victim, Beowulf, but he was destined for no more victims that night. Beowulf took hold of the beast with his bare, powerful hands, and fearful, the beast struggled to free itself. That struggle shook the entire hall, and the wails of the creature terrified the Danes who waited outside. Beowulf's companions were powerless to help him, because the monster had put a spell on them. Finally, Beowulf wrenched off Grendel's right arm, and the maimed beast fled back to its home. Beowulf had vanquished the fiend without even shield or spear. The poet proclaims, "The wise and brave warrior from afar had cleansed Hrothgar's hall, reclaiming it from woe." As a sign of victory, Beowulf hung the monster's bloody arm on the wall as a trophy. The hall was then cleansed, repaired, and decorated for the celebration that would follow. Hrothgar and his men honored Beowulf with another feast, and with magnificent, priceless gifts. The poet says, "The men drank wine, ignorant of fate or how grim calamity had befallen many men." Hrothgar departed for his court, and the warriors slept in the hall as they did before. Grendel's mother appeared that night. Brooding and miserable, she made a sorry journey to avenge her son. She rushed into the great hall and seized Eshere, a famed and heroic warrior who was the king's dearest counselor and friend. Grendel's mother then tore her son's severed arm from the wall and fled into the darkness with the arm and Eshere. Through all this, Beowulf had been asleep in a house, some distance from the hall. He did not learn of the she-monster's visit until the next morning, when he innocently asked Hrothgar if he'd had an easy night. When he heard what had transpired the night before, he vowed to free the people of this second, even more wretched demon. Beowulf turned to comfort the king, who grieved over the loss of his dear friend Eshere, with these words, "Grieve not, wise warrior. It is better to avenge one's friend than mourn too much. Each of us must one day reach the end of worldly life. Let him who can live in glory before he dies, that lives on after him when he lifeless lies." With King Hrothgar leading the way, the Danes and Beowulf cautiously approached the marsh lair where Grendel and his mother lived. When they arrived at the edge of the moor, the soldiers came upon the head of the ill-fated Eshere and saw stains of blood in the water. Swimming in that water were fire drakes and sea dragons. Beowulf readied himself to descend into the water, down to the home of the foe. Unferth, who had previously mocked Beowulf about his performance in the swimming contest, now offered him his own blood-hardened sword, the finest in the kingdom, which he said never in battle was untrue to any man. In doing so, he forfeited a chance to win for himself immortal fame and glory, for he would not enter the waters. Beowulf sank himself into the deep, murky waters, and was at once surrounded by enormous and vicious creatures. After an immense struggle, he continued on, descending for nearly a day before he reached the bottom. He came to the cave of Grendel's mother and entered. The battle began. Beowulf at first tried to wound the monster with Unferth's sword, but for the first time this weapon failed. He turned instead to his mighty hand grip, said to be strong enough to match the strength of 30 men. He was able to grasp the monster by the shoulder, but she threw him to the ground and tried to stab him with her dagger. Beowulf was protected by his sturdy armor, without which he would have perished. In the hand-to-hand combat that followed, he was almost overcome. Then fate intervened. On the floor of the monster's den, in the midst of other weapons pried from the hands of fallen warriors, Beowulf saw a legendary sword that had once belonged to a race of ancient giants. He stretched with all his might and managed to take hold of the invincible and strong-edged blade. He plunged it into the heart of Grendel's mother, who first rose and then fell in a heap of death. Beowulf then turned and saw Grendel himself lying crippled on the ground nearby. Swiftly he swung the sword again and cut Grendel's loathsome head from his body. The warriors waiting above saw the water turn red and concluded Beowulf had died. The Danes returned sadly to the hall, but Beowulf's men remained, gazing sadly at the sight of their lord's death. Now Beowulf left the cave and began his swim towards the surface. But as he did, the wondrous sword melted, leaving only the head and hilt intact. When they saw Beowulf alive and once again undefeated, the men rejoiced, and the Danes offered him yet another feast. Beowulf gave the sword hilt as a gift to Hrothgar and laid the head of the monster at his feet. Then he returned Unferth's weapon to him without speaking of its uselessness. This, comments the poet, is the mark of a great and generous warrior. Now it was time for Beowulf to return to his homeland of the Geats. He took leave of the grateful King Hrothgar, who was grieved to see him go. The lines read, "The man was so dear to him that he could not restrain the feeling in his breast, but in his heart, held in the bonds of thought, longing after the dear man flamed against blood." Beowulf left Denmark in great glory, and was received in glory at home. When he returned to the court of Hygelac, he was rewarded with riches and high position. He himself laid the treasure he received from the Danes at the feet of his king. And after several years, when Hygelac and his successor had both been killed, Beowulf himself became king of the Geats. Beowulf reigned wisely and bravely for 50 years, and then one day a runaway serf, suffering from the displeasure of his master, stumbled across an ancient treasure and stole away with a golden goblet. He presented it to his master in hopes of winning greater favor. But the treasure from which he'd taken the goblet had been in the guardianship of a mighty dragon. For 3 centuries it had remained intact, and when the dragon found it missing, it rose in fury and began to ravage the villages of Geat with fire. Beowulf was now an old man, and he knew he was tired and had lost some of his strength. He was somewhat melancholy, but when the dragon destroyed his own home, he was roused to action. He became determined to rid his kingdom of this scourge, and to win the rest of the dragon's treasure for his people. He ordered that an iron shield be made, instead of the customary wooden ones. He sensed this might be his final battle, so he paused to gather strength, to bid farewell to his faithful subjects, and to reflect on his long life of valiant deeds. Then he advanced towards the dragon's cave, guided by the servant who stole the cup, and accompanied by 12 companions. He stopped outside the cave, momentarily saddened because he knew his end was near. The poem says, "His mind was sad, wandering and death-dwelling, his doom near at hand, which the old man must salute and seek his soul reward, parting asunder life from body." Then, ready for battle, Beowulf said, "I have undertaken many battles in my youth. I will seek again conflict as a sagacious guardian of my people, and gloriously defeat the atrocious spoiler if he will seek me out from his earth hall." He ordered his warriors to withdraw, so that he alone might battle the horrible beast. "It is not your venture to match your might with the fearful foes, to do this heroic deed. By daring shall I gain the gold, or dire battle, ending life, will take your lord away." Then he advanced to meet the dragon. Inside the cave, Beowulf found that his shield was little protection against the dragon's fiery breath. But still he plunged on through the flames, and struck the dragon's side with his famed and ancient sword. The sword had no effect against the dragon's tough hide. The foil shattered on the creature's bony plate, and the infuriated dragon only belched forth more intense fire. Once again, Beowulf was forced to resort to his strong grip. As the battle grew more savage, all the king's warriors fled into the woods, except one. Wiglaf, a young kinsman of Beowulf, stood by to defend his ruler. He rallied his lord's spirits by saying, "Dear Beowulf, perform as well as you said in your youth that you would not let your greatness sink while you were alive." Then, unable to restrain himself any longer, Wiglaf hurled himself into the flames, waving his own sword. The dragon, full of wrath, fell upon both warriors and covered them in flames. The flames consumed Wiglaf's wooden shield, and he sought cover under the iron shield of Beowulf. Beowulf's sword finally failed him, snapping in half. Never in any of his battles had iron served him. The dragon rushed and sank its terrible fangs into Beowulf's neck, but Wiglaf, ignoring his hand, which was scorched from the fire, bravely struck the beast on its underside with his sword and his war-knife. Immediately the fire began to lessen. Beowulf, coming to his senses, then gave the dragon the final death blow, ripping its belly open with his dagger. Now, weak from loss of blood, the old hero sat down. He knew the effects of the venom from the dragon's fangs, and awaited his death. He asked Wiglaf to show him the treasure hoard so he could die more peacefully. Wiglaf brought as much of the treasure as he could carry, and Beowulf thanked God that he'd been able to acquire so much wealth for his people. Then he gave Wiglaf instructions for his funeral pyre, and made a gift of his ring, helmet, and armor to the young man, who was the last of his family line. His final words were, "You are the last remnant of our race. Destiny has taken all my kinsmen to the Godhead, earls in their valor. I shall follow them." Wiglaf mourned the passing of his hero and kinsman. The dragon lay nearby, lifeless but still bleeding. Legend says no hero, however courageous, had ever braved the fire of the dragon or touched its treasure hoard. The companions of Beowulf emerged from the woods where they had fled. Wiglaf denounced them as cowards who could have saved Beowulf's life. He said that death is better than the dishonor that will surely follow them. After learning of the events in the cave, the whole company came to see the body of the fallen warrior and the corpse of the slain dragon. No one dared touch the treasure, thinking only a man of God's choosing could do it. The princes who placed the treasure in the cave had pronounced a curse on it that should last until the last day of the world. Wiglaf gave the order to prepare Beowulf's funeral pyre. Next he summoned 7 of the best men, and with them entered the cave of the dragon. They heaved the body of the dragon over a cliff and loaded the treasure onto a wagon. The Geat troops honored their lord with magnificent funeral rites. The body of Beowulf was burned on a pyre according to pagan custom. The roar of the flames mingled with the cries of the mourners until the body of the hero had crumbled into pieces. Over a period of 10 days, a great mound was built over the king's ashes that could be seen by seafarers off the coast. The cursed treasure was buried in the mound, useless now as it was before. Beowulf was given a final eulogy. Thus his hearth companions in the host of the Geats mourned the going of their lord. They said that of worldly kings he was the mildest of men and the gentlest, most kind to his people, most eager for fame. With these final words, most eager for fame, or in some interpretations, desirous of renown, we have a summary of the theme of Beowulf, and a glimpse into the most important values of the people of its time. This value is called lof, a word difficult to translate with precision, but which roughly means the praise and esteem of one's countrymen. This theme is stated very clearly at the beginning of the poem, with the line, "For among all peoples, it is only through those actions which merit praise that a man may prosper." Fame, then, is the most permanent of all things in this society. It even transcends death. Throughout the story, Beowulf is described as a man hungry for fame and desirous of renown. This desire came from a sense of the people of that time that life was transient, unstable, and impermanent. Fate, which they called weird, was impersonal, and man was powerless against it. Yet, according to the poet, man could still act. He could use the small amount of free will he's given to make the right choices, because, as the poem states, unless a man is doomed beforehand, fate is likely to be favorable to the courageous. Thus, free will should be used to demonstrate courage, and courage in turn will guarantee fame, the only thing worth having, the only thing that lasts. Courage was part of the Anglo Saxon ethic, but there was more, too. Beowulf sums up the entire ethic when, as he's dying, he says he can rejoice in his life because he did not swear false oaths, defended what was his, did not pick quarrels, and can never be accused of the worst of all crimes, the murder of his own kin. He accepts his death calmly. It's been decreed by the almighty Weird. Throughout the poem, Beowulf alternately puts his faith in Weird, or fate, and the Lord God. He says at one point that fate goes ever as it must, which corresponds with the theme that man possesses little free will and is at the mercy of higher forces. Close to his death, he also remarks that he has endured his destiny. This is the classic resignation of the Stoic warrior. Within his limits, he has done the best that he can. Yet it is the Lord God triumphant who Beowulf believes has given him victory over Grendel's mother, the she-monster. And the poet tells us that the Danes can't expect relief from Grendel because they have fallen away from the true God. After Beowulf defeats the monsters, both Hrothgar, the Danish king, and Hygelac, the Geat king, give thanks to God. And finally, when dying, it is God whom Beowulf thanks for his heroic victories. These apparent contradictions between an impersonal fate and God were explained earlier. The Anglo Saxons were recent converts to Christianity, and still held to some Germanic traditions that seemed opposite to Christian beliefs. The poet himself seems sometimes overcome with the confusion this created. He has trouble determining whether Grendel the monster is descended from Cain, the first murderer. And although the Old Testament, with Cain and Abel, the flood, and its vengeful, jealous portrayal of God, would have been easy for the Anglo-Saxons to understand, they would have had a much more difficult time with the New Testament and its turn-the-other-cheek morality. So, although there are some New Testament themes in the poem, they are only briefly and indirectly mentioned. Beowulf indicates to historians just how slow and gradual was the infusion of Christian thought into the existing culture. Whether or not Christianity or pagan themes provide the message of the story, the message is at least clear in one sense. The struggle between good and evil is a mighty struggle, and good eventually triumphs. It triumphs through individuals of uncommon valor and integrity who succeed where many before them have failed. To many readers, Grendel's mother symbolizes evil, just as Beowulf symbolizes good. Beowulf descends into her underwater lair, into the forbidden darkness, much as a hero would descend into hell or the netherworld. There are other spiritual themes in the poem, too, for instance, purification. Beowulf referred to this directly when he said he would rid the land of the monster Grendel and thereby purify it. After he completes the deed, the warriors wash down the high hall, removing bloodstains and other traces of the battle, a scene many people see as a symbolic purification of sin. Grendel himself is described in ways that can only remind the reader of Satan, a wicked spoiler of men, the fiend, the criminal, the grim guest, the one with fire-hard hands from whose eye a horrid flame stood. Grendel stalks in from the moor, an area we are told is off-limits to the unbaptized. The dragon, too, in its dark den, breathing fire, seems symbolic of a creature from hell. Beowulf is a difficult work for many people, both the average reader and the trained scholar. The language, the style, the philosophy, and apparent paradoxes of thought, the unclear references, and its place in time, are all subjects of controversy, and until and if further discoveries are made, these controversies may never be resolved. Yet its themes of heroism, of the struggle between good and evil, and of the attempts of humans to make their lives as worthy as possible, are all understandable and supersede its importance as a chronicle of an earlier time that is still wrapped in a veil of mystery.
This is the end of the session.